Welcome to episode 6 of Community as a Verb, a show that talks about the tools for social action. We're talking about social media, systems, processes, and strategies, and what we're doing to create the world that we want to see. My name is Conner Cayson, your co-host here at Community as a Verb, and next to me, via the powers of the internet, is my astounding co-host, Mr. Well-Traveled. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. I love the intro. I always love the intro. It just makes my day, lightens my day too.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Well-Traveled, good to see you again 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
It was kind of a wild time. We wanted to do an episode last week, and then the election wasn't solved, at least when we talked about it on Friday night, and it was like, do we really want to do this with the election still not officially confirmed? And then we woke up Saturday morning with the announcement of the election and was like, oh, we probably should have done it. But that doesn't matter at this point. We're here now on Saturday, and I'm very happy to see you. And so how are you doing? What's been going on since 2 weeks ago when we saw you here on video? How are you dealing with the world right now?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about the future. I mean, we're in a moment of transition, right, in our country. But then also, we've been living through a pandemic for the past however many months now, 8, 9 months. I don't know how many months we're in now. I've lost count. I used to count by days and then weeks, and now we're months in, and soon we'll be a year in, right? So of course I'm dealing with that, right? There's so much change all around us, whether it's the election, the pandemic, or even just life in general. There's a lot happening. And I think for me, I'm thinking we're also at the end of a year, right? This is November. We're almost going into 2021. And as we look forward, I'm thinking about what is next? What's next for me? What's next for our country? What's next for the world?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the coronavirus, because I think it's important to be documenting here in this time, because it's this maybe the scariest week, right? When I think back of how I felt in March and April, and there was so much anxiety, right? Like that time, it felt scary to go outside, right? And so now as it's gone on, everyone's just gotten so much more comfortable with whatever the routine is, but I think we almost had 1 million cases this week. And Amanda told me a stat that she saw with almost 1 million people testing positive this week. That's 1 in 350, 340 people in America alone tested positive this week. And that's really scary to see, where we've come and what's going to happen, right? We're all kind of waiting for what's going to happen in every state and every city. Jay Inslee here in Washington put out an announcement that Oregon, California, and Washington are recommending, if you're doing interstate travel, that you do a 14-day quarantine. And a lot of the businesses here are kind of preparing for, is a shutdown going to happen again? And so how are you dealing just with the coronavirus and everything happening in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I mean, it's here in Texas. Texas this week hit 1 million cases since the start of the pandemic, and that has been all over the news. But here it's a little bit different, right? The culture around masks has been highly politicized, and around shutdowns as well. So right now things are normal, but the story on the news yesterday was, is a shutdown coming, right? And restaurants are starting to prepare here. And when you start hearing things like that, I remember back in March what that was like, thinking to myself, okay, maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't. And now I feel like the pattern is repeating itself, that maybe by the end of the month, we'll see at least one state shut down. And then once that domino falls, I think we'll start to see more shutdowns. I think what's different this time around is I feel more prepared. I wasn't prepared in March when there was a shutdown, but I have masks, I have gloves, I have, soap to wash my hands, I have hand sanitizer. I understand social distancing. I know what to do and where to go. I've got my Amazon account popping. The packages keep coming. I'm good, right? In that regard, like I'm ready for this, and we've been living through it for so long that I know that there are things that I'm just not going to do. I'm not going to travel. I'm not going to get on a plane. I'm not going to go to inside of a restaurant or a bar or a crowded space for social reasons. I mean, I have been to doctor's appointments since the pandemic. I've gone and had to have my cell phone serviced, things like that, but unless it's something that's an absolute, this is the only way I can handle it. If I can't handle it over the phone or through the mail, I know what precautions to take, and I know what my level of comfort is. And I'm very observant about my environment. I know people around in Texas are not wearing masks. I know that the weather is really nice here, and so people are out and people are doing things. And so, I take advantage of all of the services that allow me to just avoid being around large groups of people, curbside pickup for groceries and for Target if I need, things, using the mail system to have things delivered. That seems to be right now the thing that makes me feel like I can handle this thing. But I am uncomfortable with the idea that the case count continues to rise because at least right now, I don't know anyone directly who has been affected by the virus. But as the case count rises and the community spread grows, I imagine at some point I will know someone, and I hope that I'm not exposed to that person and then contract the virus myself. Like that is still a real concern for me.
Yeah, definitely. And so earlier you're talking about like going to the doctor and going to the phones. Like we're all learning about what things in our daily life are essential, right? The word essential has become very much in the forefront of how we make decisions. But one of the most essential things about being an American is voting in our elections.
That was an interesting transition. I didn't know where you were going with that.
Everyone is well aware of last week and the election that we had, the biggest turnout in voting history. And a lot of very, very big surprises, right? I think I was a little bit more optimistic than you were. I think you had a understanding of how that was going to go, and you had prepared yourself a lot for the election. And if you want to start there, we can, but I also want to put out the question, just to start, I just want to know, like, what was last week like for you, right? Hundreds of millions of us were glued to our television from Tuesday morning until at least Saturday, if not beyond that. So walk us through kind of how you felt, what you did to prepare, how you dealt with the week and the anxiety of everything.
As we enter this discussion about how we felt about the last week and what's been going on, I really want to lay out this as my goal for this episode. And it's that I want this episode to be a letter to the future voters. And I want the future voters to remember this moment. What was very important to me as I started thinking about us having this conversation was that what we are about to do here is to document exactly how we felt, what happened, and at least as far as we can remember it. And I think by us recording this will last for as long as there is internet, right? And this is something that people can come back to as a way to be reminded of this moment, because I am very, very certain that this moment is both the continuation and the beginning of something. We are living through a very significant year in history, and we are living through a very significant election. And for me, as I started to prepare for what was to come, all of the chaos that we have seen, I was very fortunate to be able to listen to a bunch of podcasts and read a bunch of articles that reflected upon 20 years ago in the 2000 election. And everything that started during that election, the strategy around contesting votes and going to the Supreme Court, and all of the thinking around that and the emotion around that is present right now. And so it helped me to prepare mentally for what I should think about as someone who wants to see change. So I want the voters of the future to be able to come and have this as a resource, one of many, because there's a lot out there that they can point back to. But I want to make sure that what we are providing is a resource for them to be able to say, what did happen in 2020? And how did people feel? And we're two people, we are regular people, we are also voters. And so this is our experience that we're about to share.
I love that. A letter to the future voters, like that's the title, everybody. And so let's start first with a continuation of the previous episode. Give me a rundown about the app that you created. It's your background of your photo right now. Let's start there, and then we'll go into more detail about Tuesday and the week.
Yeah, so, okay. So we were ready. We were ready for election day, and I was so excited. And then Monday, I broke my glasses. And so I had to go get some contacts. And so that was a funny situation. And then election day hit. App is on the App Store. It's getting downloads, and we're watching the numbers go up. And I didn't understand. I said, this doesn't make any sense. We have $0 marketing budget. How are people finding out about this? We have like 70 followers on Instagram. This doesn't make sense. I've promoted this mainly through word of mouth. I don't understand what's happening right now. And, making the app available, keeping the data updated, part of that was manually on my part. And that was one of the things that I was doing. That part was smooth. We had one tech issue at the very beginning of the day. The website was down at the very beginning of the day. So around 6 a.m. So polls opened at 7. And so 6 a.m. I'm like, hey, the website's down. And luckily DeMarcus was able to just jump right in and fix that problem. But when I woke up that morning on Tuesday, there was an announcement that had come out really late that night by the Harris County county clerk. And basically what he said was that due to the court ruling that happened the day before, so on Monday, regarding curbside voting, or drive-through voting, I think was the official name of that one. So curbside is more like if you have a disability, then you can ask for someone to come out to your car. But drive-through voting is you literally drive through like you're driving through at McDonald's or something like that. And the ruling, so the Republican Party contested the votes that had been cast during early voting through the drive-through method. And there were about 100,000 votes. And they wanted all of those votes to be thrown out. Well, a judge decided that those votes would not be thrown out, but that the setup for drive-through voting needed to be a permanent structure. And it was very clearly defined that the permanent structure had a foundation and a roof, a fixed roof. Well, up until that point, drive-through voting had actually taken place via tents. So you could drive up to a tent and you would be serviced by a poll worker there. And people loved it. I mean, it was something that was being used by all types of people, all walks of life. And I thought that was a really cool innovation in voting, but the county clerk decided that to protect the vote going forward so that this challenge didn't come up again, he would just move to a different location for drive-through voting, and it was the Toyota Center. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't update that information in the app in the way that I would have liked. So I had to manually just kind of like make a note at that location. And then there were about 6 other locations that were added the night before that we didn't have time to put into the app. But apart from that, that was our biggest problem. Now, I think, so much of my time and effort and energy, right, had gone into creating this app to be used on election day. Here's the thing. We had over 1,400 downloads. We had definitely quite a bit of activity. I think the number was something like 3.8 searches per minute, something like that. So we had some activity. But I am not so sure that it was, really necessary for election day. And I'll tell you why. Because we had 1.6 million total voters during this entire election cycle. 1.4 of them voted during early voting. Wow. And although the app was live during early voting, it wasn't as functional as we wanted it to be for early voting. And so we were like focused solely on making sure we were ready for election day. 200,000 people voted election day, and most of the polling places stayed green the entire day. So I should mention, when I say green, I mean like green is like short wait, yellow is medium wait, and red is like a long wait, and at an unacceptable level, so like 40 minutes plus. So basically all of the polling locations for all 800 plus for almost the entire 12-hour period had a 25-minute wait or less. There were very few instances during the day where I saw that a polling location had turned red. And so while I was very excited that we had all of these downloads and we had this activity, I'm like, there's nothing for people to look at and do, because it's like, it's green. Everything's green. They're good. They can go wherever they want to go. They can vote. They're good.
Oh man. Well, what a lesson, right? Because you just didn't anticipate that.
I didn't.
It speaks for the preparedness of a lot of people, which is promising, and the fact that a lot of those early ballot drop locations were successful. There are some positives that came out of Harris County, but that's really interesting on kind of the things that you learned and didn't anticipate.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate that at all. It was an assumption. I mean, that's the thing. That's what happens in design, right? And that's what happens in entrepreneurship. You make assumptions, and my assumption was wrong. But let me tell you, I want to be clear here. I am really happy at that turnout. I'm very happy that people did come out and vote early. That engagement in the voting process is so cool. So I'm glad I had a tool that was ready, but I'm glad to be honest, I'm glad nobody really needed it.
Yeah. That's a great point, right? It's one of those things, was like the fact that you didn't need to have the tool be used, and makes it show that there was some success within a system that we both would agree is fighting against those people a lot of times. I know we've talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
So let's go outside the app, right? And I'll start a little bit with Tuesday. We all go to bed on Monday. Tuesday's the big day. I know millions and millions of people were looking forward to it. I actually didn't submit my ballot early. And voting day is always the same for me, no matter if it's a small election or one of these big elections. I've had the same tradition for like the last 6 years since I started primary in Seattle. And this was the first one that was different. I guess the last primary here in Seattle was the first one that was different. But usually, Amanda and I, we always go out to dinner and we fill out our ballot like at a local business, right? We sit at dinner, we have dinner, we always have the books that we get our mail in, and we like fill it out and we have a discussion. And it's always like, it's always just like a fun night. And I've always promoted that on my stories. And this year, obviously very different. I ain't going out and sitting in a restaurant to fill out this ballot. But same thing, I filled it all out. We did a similar thing at home. And I always just love walking to that mailbox, right? On election day, like first thing in the morning, always documenting a little bit on my story. And so put my ballot in the mailbox. Great to see, a lot less crowded than the mailboxes normally are. Usually there's like a line of people just waiting to drop it in the mailbox. But so many people voted early. And we get home and I like create a whole schedule for Tuesday to distract me, right? I was like, there's no point in looking at any of this news or any of the information until at least 8 p.m. So I like stacked up my whole day with like meetings and activities and things to do. And between 8 p.m. and midnight, though, was just dead staring at the TV, right? Watching number by number by number coming in, like cheering, like getting nervous. You experience all of the emotions in one day, especially with seeing how things were getting counted, right? And some of the, like, no one really knew how they were going to count the election. I mean, you could if you did the research, but I wasn't aware of like, oh, every state's going to do this differently. I think we should have assumed that by our other conversation, that everyone does voting differently. But it was crazy to watch. Like some states decided to do the early votes and mail-in ballots first, and some did them later. And so to see all the change, and for a lot of Tuesday night, I was preparing myself for a Trump victory. It was starting to look that way very, very early on to me, especially when he got Florida in a handily way. It was a little concerning for me. And then on Tuesday night, right, so it's like midnight, and it's like, all right, we're definitely not going to get the results tonight. Amanda and I had this big debate about what we're going to do. Because the one thing I didn't want to do is wake up on Wednesday and like take an adrenaline shot of fear or excitement based off the election results. So like I intentionally didn't sleep by my phone. I put my phone out in the living room, and I didn't want to wake up and like go look at it. Amanda had a very different opinion of doing that, but I woke up on Wednesday and I prepared myself. Like I sat there for a couple of minutes, like, all right, we're going to walk out to this living room and like, we're going to figure out the future of the world. And I walked down and was like, nothing had changed, right? Like not very many votes had been counted in the morning. And then that kept going on. But I spent the next 4 days, like just staring, going back between CNN, ABC, NBC, and Fox News just to see like what all the different mainstream media perspectives were, every single day, right? And I would say Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of that week, my productivity was extremely low. Didn't really do anything. I couldn't think about anything else, right? Like it was just constantly like, how many votes came in from what state? What's Arizona doing? What's Nevada doing? What's Pennsylvania doing? Where's Georgia? Joe's coming back in Georgia. Go Georgia, go Georgia. Like it was now in hindsight, it was the most entertaining sport I've ever watched. Like I'm glad that I can feel that way now, because when I went to bed on Tuesday, I was really worried that the election was going to go a different direction. And it's nice to feel like, okay, at least we had this small win. And looking back, it was like, oh, that was a great World Series of back and forth. And it felt like a sporting event, the way the numbers came in. It was exciting and terrifying all at the same time. So how was it for you?
No, it was very similar. It's just funny. I was just like, I'm laughing at all of this because I felt a lot of those emotions. And I would say something, okay, so the first thing I actually want to ask about here is, what did you eat? Because you said you didn't go to a restaurant. So what did you eat? Did you get like Uber Eats, or did you do takeout, or?
I actually don't remember.
Wow.
I didn't like do an intentional meal this time. The whole process was really like thrown off. Usually I'm very intentional about where I choose, but even with Find Me in Seattle, my intention with eating has kind of like gone out the drain. I can't remember what I had yesterday. It's all like, I'm not sure what I ate on Monday night. Last week.
I guess most people probably can't remember what they ate. The only reason I asked was because you mentioned. I remember exactly what I had on Tuesday night, but last week. But the reason why I was asking that is because I know that you mentioned that it's a part of a ritual, and so I thought, well, maybe there was some intentional meal that you had that you just got it a different way. And you posted something recently that is still on my mind. I don't know how to find it here, but you went to this Thai food truck, and that food looked so good that I missed good Thai food, because Seattle has great Thai, actually. And I don't know where to find that around here. So I was hoping maybe you were going to say you had Thai.
I wouldn't be surprised. I eat Thai food every single week, like almost guaranteed. My wife is from Thai descent. Her mom is from Thailand. And so, and I live within like 4 blocks. I have 5 Thai restaurants. So we pretty much like we have a dish that we love at each one. They kind of all have their specialty in our eyes now. But when you get back, we'll have to go eat some Thai food when it's safe to do so.
Yeah, well, I definitely have some spots that I like. So, yeah, we can get into that another time. Because I could go all day about these places. So, all right. So the other thing I wanted to mention that you brought up was a part of my feeling as I was watching these results, just like everyone else. I think to your something you said as well, that, productivity was down. I mean, I think that was true. Like I was, of course, I work from home, and I'm online and video calling with my coworkers all day, and that's all everyone was talking about was what did you hear? When was the last update? What state just said what? And it was just all consuming for the last week, and nothing changed. That was the crazy part. Nothing changed for days. Like we didn't get another update until Saturday, and so it was like, Tuesday, and then nothing. And it was like, okay, it's 253. It's still 253. The number is 253 for electoral votes for Biden. The number, nothing changed. It just didn't move. And it was like time just stood still for 3-4 days. Now, in that time, I really learned a lot about how other states run their electoral systems. It was fascinating to me to listen to the press conferences from the different election officials from every state, because what it pointed out to me very clearly, you know how I am about like things need to have standard processes. That is a risk, I think, to our system. The decentralized nature of it, I actually think is a strength of our system, that it is decentralized like that. But the variation, I think, is a problem, because people don't know how it works. Like, you may or may not know how it works in your state, right? The electoral system. But this is a group project. And what I felt like was this was the worst group project in the history of group projects, because as you're sitting there, you're like, okay, well, Washington State, we did our part. Texas, we did our part. California, we did our part. What's going on with Arizona? Like, hey, we're waiting for you to turn in your part of the project. Georgia, come on, pick it up. Like, that is the issue with this. And the reason why things were slow, to your point about the variation in the processes, it has to do with just that like Pennsylvania, by law, could not start counting mail-in ballots until midnight on election day, whereas other states were counting mail-in ballots first. Some states decided we will count all of the in-person election day first, and then we'll count all of the mail-in and early voting after. I mean, it's ridiculous, because in that gap of time that we're all sitting there, or all of us around the country waiting for these results, you have conspiracy theories. You had people showing up to the polling locations with, banging on the window saying, "Let us in." Their accusations of voter fraud. Like, that's the problem. That's why you need to have a standard process that everyone can understand and can be transparent. Now, yes, there was great transparency, because there were video cameras inside of these polling places. People are counting, and you can watch on live TV. Live TV, they were showing people counting votes. When have you ever seen that? Like, that was what the story was, and you're sitting there watching on CNN, someone just sitting there counting votes by hand. Okay, that's great. I'm glad we have that level of transparency. But we need a standard process across the country so that people can continue to believe that the system is working. And what I was most concerned about was that there were too many people questioning, is this system working properly? And once you start to have people lose trust in the system, and it actually threatens, I say, the whole thing, right? Like, all of democracy. If you cannot trust that your vote is going to be counted. And on the flip side, right, the lawsuits that were going on immediately, which we knew were coming. Those lawsuits were very clearly targeting the places where vote counting was happening, and the goal was to get those votes thrown out. And the goal very specifically was to stop counting, stop counting in a democracy, stop counting votes. That, to me, right there, I was so. I didn't even know how to feel about that. At the moment, I was like, I can't even believe this is happening. Like, I still can't even believe. I was listening to a podcast this morning about a poll. I don't know if she was an election. I guess she was an election official in Detroit, and her, sort of documenting her memory of her day and week, kind of dealing with people showing up to the polling location and threatening her and all of these things. And they actually played some of the sound during the podcast, and I just thought to myself, this is crazy. This is going beyond just being upset at the results, because what she also pointed out was something that I hadn't thought about. She said, I'm in Detroit, and while in Detroit, this is a city that is blue, and in a county that ultimately is blue. The same thing that happened there happened in other cities that have large African American populations. That's number one. So that happened in Philly, that happened in Atlanta, happened in Detroit. Okay, so these are all of the places where we're waiting for votes to be counted. But also, what she mentioned about Detroit, she said, they didn't go to Ann Arbor, right? They didn't go to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there's a lot of liberal, white professors, and they also voted blue there. They didn't go there. And then she mentioned another city that I'm not familiar with, and she said, there are a lot of wealthy people there that also voted blue. They didn't go to those places, and those places have smaller African American populations. And so the only conclusion one can draw is that your argument for stopping the count, your argument for voter fraud, is targeted towards African American voters. You are trying to suppress the vote of African American voters, which is exactly what we have been dealing with since the very beginning of the right to vote for African Americans in this country. So I think me seeing that may have been a little bit different maybe than how other people saw it, but I just saw, here comes history repeating itself and showing up again and again and again and again. And right now in this moment, I'm watching it on live TV, and it was frightening. I guess maybe that is the best way I can put it.
Yeah, it totally was. And for the accusations coming out from the president, right, with very little evidence. So let's say the president and a lot of his staff and his children, right, putting out all these conspiracy theories, where in one state we have protesters who show up to the polling stations in Pennsylvania or Philadelphia, I believe it's Philadelphia, and they're banging on the windows, right, saying stop the count. And then conversely, we have Arizona, where a bunch of protesters, let's point out, all these protesters are white. They show up to Arizona, and they're marching outside the polling stations, and they're saying count the vote. Right? Because at this point, Joe Biden has the lead by 400,000 there. So we've got people who are on the same side, who mostly voted for the same person, chanting the exact opposite things on their side. And it's when you're watching it and you're seeing them cut back and forth between these two, it's mind blowing, right? And at the same time, I know I don't want to talk about Donald Trump, but his terribleness needs to be mentioned for the sake of history, right? He's declaring victory on Tuesday, right? Saying that he should win because he's ahead by so many votes. At the same time saying, oh, and there's all of this fraud happening, right? But the votes that haven't been counted in Arizona, those are legitimate. But the votes that haven't been counted in Pennsylvania, those are illegitimate, right? And he's contradicting himself and just putting out all this information that it's just not true. There's no proof. There's no evidence. And all these are coming out on Twitter. Twitter's flagging every single post. So when you go to Donald Trump's Twitter, all it is blank tweets that you have to opt in to view, because he's just spewing nonsense, and
he's lying.
He's lying. He's lying. And he's just puking nonsense all over the internet for everyone to see. And yeah, absolutely despicable, not presidential at all. And just.
And Conner, we should note, as we sit here more than a week past the election, he still has not conceded.
He has not conceded yet. And a lot of people in his party have also not conceded, right? They haven't congratulated Joe Biden. Almost the entire world, and at least in the perspective of leadership, have acknowledged that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And we have things going on right now up to, at this point, when Donald Trump won 4 years ago, he started getting the presidential security briefings in the morning every day. Donald Trump's not, supposedly, from what I've read, he doesn't read those anyways anymore. But Joe Biden still hasn't gotten some of that information, right? And so Donald Trump is doing everything he can to entertain himself, right, with no evidence, no support. What he's putting out in the world is also not what's being reflected in the courts either. I know Wall Street Journal reported yesterday about how a lot of the court filings that are being submitted don't match up with what Donald Trump's saying. Right, just because there's not really any evidence, right?
There's no evidence.
There's no evidence. It's really just appealing to the conspiracy side of his base and trying to build that up. And he's treating America like it's a game show and not our democracy on the line.
What game show? What game show? Is it Survivor? Is it Big Brother? I'm sure. Is it Real Housewives? I'm trying to figure out like what show are we talking about? Because I mean, he's the reality show president. I mean, he was on one of the biggest reality. He was the star of one of the biggest reality shows at the time that it was on TV, right before he became president. And so, is it The Apprentice? Is this The Apprentice? Because if this is The Apprentice, then the American people just told him he's fired. Like that was his big catchphrase, right? You're fired. Well, the American people, at least half of them, the half that voted for Biden, they voted. I've said this before. I don't know if I said this on the show or not, but I've said before that I don't know that always in this situation that people were voting for Joe Biden as much as they were voting against Donald Trump. And, I think for the half of America that voted against Donald Trump, I think that is significant. And the message is you're fired. And that is the whole point of democracy, right? That is what we're allowed to do in the democracy. That's why we vote. If we didn't have a system like this, then we would just get who is selected for us. And in this particular case, the system, as it is designed, flaws and all, it seems to have worked for the half that showed up to vote. But there are always going to be sore losers out there in the world. And, I think for me, I looked at two things, right? How you end up with a Donald Trump has everything to do with how the system is designed, and also how you end up with a Joe Biden has everything to do with how the system is designed. And so I think there's still going to be a lot of unsatisfied voters out there on both sides. And I don't mean that they're the same group of people necessarily, but by that I mean, if you voted for Trump, you had a very clear reason why you voted for Trump, and he is not going to be the president. If you voted for Biden, that doesn't necessarily mean you voted for him because he was the person you wanted to see elected as president. He was the option that you had who was not Donald Trump. Yeah. So you may not be satisfied with his administration, right? So if you're not satisfied with his administration, what are you going to spend your time thinking about and working on? And that, for me, I think is probably the bigger conversation that we are not having right now, is that, on last Saturday, Joe Biden was declared the winner. But what I saw was people in the streets. I saw people dancing, people having a wonderful time, because in that moment, I think that they were celebrating the fact that the half of the country that voted against Donald Trump won. Their voices were heard. They were able, all the organizing that has happened, all of the posts on social media saying, go vote, go vote, go vote. We talked about that last episode. It worked. Everything worked. We had the biggest turnout in the history of the country, right? On both sides.
On both sides, yeah.
On both sides. But now, what policy do you care about? How do you want to see that enacted, right? Or what do you want to see happen now? And I think if your number one issue is, say, coronavirus, well, we'll probably see some immediate changes there. If your number one issue is, say, systemic racism, I don't know. That might not be your ticket that's going to get you what you want. Yeah. If your number one issue is climate change, might be a little progress, a little. But I think this is where I see things starting to be very challenging in the next 4 years. Also, I should mention, right, we have, we're going to talk about Georgia in a minute, but we also have a runoff race there that is very significant that's coming. So we still don't know what is the balance of power going to look like in the Senate. So when we think about there is more work to do, it's all of that stuff, right? There's still more work to do. But coming back to just the feeling, one other thing I wanted to point out, just the feeling of last week before we get into where we are today. The other thing that I want to point out to the folks who are listening to our program in the future is that what I hope comes out of this, and what I hope starts to show up, and maybe I'll be a part of helping to make this happen through my efforts in the tech space. is that it is easy to look at a map of America and say, well, I live in this state and I only need to care about my own voting system or my own problems that exist here. But if you look at coronavirus, we're all in this together. If you look at climate change, we are all in this together. If you look at systemic racism, we are all in this together. So it doesn't matter what your issue is. What actually is really important is that you have an understanding of who the other members of the group are that you have to work with to get the project done. And so when I think about, the fact that sure, Washington State can vote blue, California can vote blue. Texas didn't vote blue. So if you are looking for a blue candidate to win the presidency, you're reliant upon other states doing their work. But if you don't understand that and understand how to support that, then you run the risk of having another version or even the same version of a Trump presidency, because the system itself is the same. It has not evolved at all. So in the entire 4 years we've been witnessing what looks like to me and to many people as someone who is trying to install themselves as America's first dictator. So if you don't want that to happen, then you have to continue to fight for voting rights at the local level, at the state level, and you have to continue to be active in your communities, but also you have to understand what's going on in the other places. What are the issues there around the voters having access to the ballot box? Because one thing that I'm very sure will happen now is that will be addressed in a systemic way that will not be very obvious to people. And it will be something that will become very clear the next time there's an election. So we have to keep our eyes on these things. I've been thinking a lot about that more and more, that Georgia flipped blue. That wasn't supposed to happen. That is if Texas is a voter suppression state, that is your number 2 voter suppression state. And we're going to get into a little bit of that in a minute. But I mean, the fact of the matter is Arizona flipped. That wasn't supposed to happen. Nevada flipped. That wasn't supposed to happen. And you still have Republicans that control those state legislatures, and they get to choose how the districts will be drawn after the census data is released. See, when we talk about strategy, we're talking about systems, okay? This is how this game is going to be played out over the next 4 years. We're going to have Republican-controlled legislatures drawing the district lines. They're going to also pass new laws. Those laws are going to be restrictive. They're going to be all kinds of things maybe we've seen in the past. We can have new poll taxes show up. We can have new voter ID laws show up. We can have, different types of restrictions on what you can and cannot do in terms of a county election official determining, can you have curbside voting? Can you have drive-through voting? Is it all in person? Can you have mail-in voting? Who gets to vote by mail? All of those things are going to be a part of tactics to reduce the power of the voter who is not going to vote red. And that is something we have to stay on top of. And it may not happen in a state that you live in, right? It may be happening in a state that you don't live in, but that doesn't mean it's not your problem, because you need those people to be able to have successfully access the ballot box in order to get the project complete.
So well said. So well said. Yeah. I love how when you started, you talked about like the 3 major things that people are kind of voting on this year, and how those are all nationwide issues. And it's very easy for someone just to be like, oh, not my state, not my problem. Not my county, not my problem. It doesn't directly affect me right here and right now, so I don't got to worry about it. But you do need to be on top of all those different issues and how things are changing. And we saw, I know in another episode, we're going to talk more about the movie All In, because you and I have discussed that privately a bunch. But when elections happen like this, like when Obama got elected, right? A lot of things changed over the next 8 to 12 years that not a lot of people were very aware of, that pretty much at that time was like, oh, Obama got elected. We don't have racism anymore. That means we can get rid of all of these rules that were protecting voter rights. And we've regressed a ton on a lot of those things, right? Yeah. And so unfortunate that back and forth, a lot of the damage that is done isn't even done on the Trump level. It's done behind closed doors with little things and little decisions that we don't see. The one more thing before we kind of get into the breakdown of Georgia is it was phenomenal to see Saturday morning, millions of people dancing in the streets, right? Literally dancing in the streets in celebration. That doesn't happen very often in America, right? It looked like we were in a third world country election, right? That we
Yeah.
took down a dictator, right? And it looked like it was our first election ever, right? Like, and for how beautiful of a thing that is, it's equally terrifying, right? Of like on the brink of where we were. But when millions of people dance in the street because you lost your job, that's very telling. Very telling. But then at the same time, I know you brought this up a lot. 70 million people still voted for Donald Trump, right?
Yes.
And 70 million in counting. Right now 72 million versus Joe Biden's 78 million, right? So that's a lot of people who did not feel the same way as everyone dancing in the street, which is really, really scary. But let's go into a little bit of detail, right? Because you mentioned earlier that Georgia flipped blue. First time it flipped blue since Bill Clinton in '94. And
yes.
Georgia had so much focus because of the way the votes were counted and the timeliness of the vote and how it all happened. A lot of us were rooting for Georgia and, expecting this comeback. I know you're not a big sports guy, but on the internet, there were a lot of sports references. Atlanta's had a rough go in sports lately. A couple years ago, they had the worst meltdown in Super Bowl history against the Patriots at a huge lead, and the Patriots came back and beat them. And so there have been these sports moments where Atlanta teams have had leads and then lost them. So to have this narrative of this comeback for the people, a lot of Atlanta, to like put this comeback out there and have the whole world be watching was just, from a sports narrative, very cool to watch. But we want to talk about how that happened a little bit, right? And give some due to the people that have been working on that for a lifetime, for decades. But obviously it's getting a lot of attention right now, right? And it starts with Stacey Abrams. Everyone's hearing about Stacey Abrams, but there are also some other people that deserve a shout out. I know you really wanted to make sure they got their name heard, right? And we give them credit. So I'll let you start with some of those names.
Okay, so here's one name so we're going to talk about Black women. This is really key, right? That all of the names I'm going to read are going to be the names of Black women. But I also want to mention, we just lost John Lewis, and John Lewis represented a district in Georgia. And so it was partly, he a great voting rights activist we've talked about on the show, someone that inspired me, someone who I've posted on the Next Up Instagram page. And so I think also when I think about Georgia and Atlanta specifically, I just think about the historic nature of what just happened, that Georgia being a part of the South, a part of this legacy of voter suppression, and the people there have organized so hard over the last 4 years to be able to overcome that. And Stacey Abrams, I knew her name from a couple of years ago when she ran for governor and lost, and that's when I became aware of a lot of the voter suppression tactics taking place there. And what was very significant about her run there was that she would have been, if she had won, the first Black governor in the history, Black female governor in the history of the United States. And I believe, based on the circumstances, I believe that, when we talk about voter fraud, there was some fraud there, and it was within the bounds of the system. So the governor who won, or the person who won, the candidate who won, Brian Kemp, was also at that time the person who was able to certify the votes. So he was both the candidate and the judge. And so you think about how much of a conflict of interest that is. Wouldn't you make sure that you win? I mean, even if there was no fraud, now there's a question, there's a cloud hanging over you, right? So Stacey Abrams saw that. She also was very well aware of all of the tactics that had started to take shape, and she built a nonprofit called Fair Fight. And she has focused on that for the last 2 years. She's written books and she's done all the interviews. I've listened to so many interviews with her. I've started listening to her book as an audiobook. She was a part of the movie All In. I think it's very much around. I haven't finished watching it, but we will get to that eventually. And it's very much around the work that she's been doing. And in the last week or so, I think everybody on social media now knows her name if they did not know it before. But the thing about what we seem to do as a culture by celebrating the individual, we forget that the individual is not alone in any of their work ever. So there are always others, and they need to be acknowledged too, because there are going to be people who are named and people who are unnamed. So Stacey Abrams has a staff. That is just a fact. Just like every leader that we celebrate has a staff, they have a team. But in this particular case, she also organized with other organizers. So her staff and her team are, while they may be unnamed, they weren't the only folks who were participating. There were leaders of other organizations that she worked with collectively to really bring new voters to this election. So I want to start off, before I get into their names, I just want to start off with, when we talk about their impact, I want to read a few numbers to you, okay? So 1.2 million African Americans in Georgia voted, and that's up from 500,000 in the 2016 election. So that's huge. That doesn't happen normally. Now, these organizers helped to register more than 800,000 new voters. This is why Georgia flipped blue. This and this alone. If people don't take anything else away from this election, it's that there is power in numbers. There is power when you come out and you participate in the democratic process. Something I want to mention, though, I don't know the numbers in Georgia, but one of the things that I observed through working on, trying to launch an app to serve the Harris County voters was that in Harris County, Texas, there were 1.6 million voters during this election cycle. And that was great. That was more than in 2016. But Harris County has 3 million registered voters. So just over half actually showed up. And I suspect that that is the same in Georgia, in Fulton County. So that means this work has to continue, because what's to come for Georgia specifically, and for all of us, is a runoff election in the Senate. And I was listening to a podcast, I believe it was The Daily by New York Times earlier this week, where they talked a little bit about the structure of that system, which I didn't know anything about in that state. I'm worried actually about that. And my hope, and I already see Stacey Abrams and the folks that whose names I'm about to mention, I've seen that they are already organizing. They've already moved to the next chapter, and that is the next chapter, and that's going to determine the balance of power in the Senate for all of us, and it's going to determine the success or failure of the policies that we feel like we have voted for when we cast a ballot for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So the other organizers I want to mention, that I want to recognize to make sure that their names are documented somewhere in a podcast, it's Tamieka Atkins, Deborah Scott, Helen Butler, and I apologize to the next person because I do not know how to pronounce this name. It looks like Nse Ufot. I'm not sure. It's Nse. That's the first name, and then Ufot. I tried to find her on Instagram. Unfortunately, it didn't look like she had a very active profile. So I was hoping she had one of those kind of profiles where she put the pronunciation of her name. So these are the other organizers who lead organizations in Georgia, and they were significant, just as significant as Stacey Abrams. And she also acknowledged them, just to be clear, because she saw that people were only giving her the credit, but she made sure she gave them the credit too. So, those folks, I'm very grateful for them. Those Black women, I am grateful for those Black women because they showed up for America.
And they've been showing up for America, right? They didn't just show up on election day, right? Like they were going out, they saw the writing, they've seen the writing on the wall probably for their entire lives, right? And they've been out there doing it before so many people even knew that was going to be an issue, right? And they saw that, hey, if we get these people out, we get them registered, we can change what our society looks like. And
yeah,
I hope that this team is put on some type of task force or some type of committee so we can replicate and duplicate and put this out into every state, right?
Yeah.
Because they've created a process. It's a very manual process, very labor intensive, kind of goes against how we feel about with technology and everything that we're working with. But like get people on the ground, in the streets, talking with people and filling out the paperwork, doing everything we can to get people to like I said, participate in the democratic process because it is a foundation of how we are going to make change. There's lots of more things that need to happen. But what they did is absolutely incredible. And I love that you wanted to mention them on the show. I'm going to make sure their names get highlighted too. I'll put them up on text here on the show so we see them.
Cool.
And thank you to all of those Black women who are changing our country by the work that they did. They deserve the recognition.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
So one thing that you mentioned that I want to also say is that, as we think about these Black women in this particular election, you did say, there have been Black women who have been doing the work. And I also wanted to mention there's a book out there. I haven't read it. I want to get it because I just heard about it this morning. It's called Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And it's by Martha S. Jones. And I was reading an article where this book was mentioned. And I just wrote down the names of some of the other Black women who have been leading the fight for voting rights since, well, it's been going on since forever, but at least within this article, it started with the 1850s. And I wanted to just make sure that we acknowledge those women because while we're talking about modern day voting rights activists, there have been from the very beginning of, I would say, people of African descent in this country, there have always been people fighting for the rights to participate in the system fully. And the names that the article mentioned were, some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. And I just also want for the voters of the future, I want them to find this book. I want them to go back and read about these particular women and understand that the language of voting rights and the strategies of voting rights really developed over time. And it developed with the leadership of Black women who have often been forgotten by history and are not mentioned when we talk about, even now, when we're talking about what the contributions of Black women have been, we only talk about them in a contemporary context as if no other women ever came before them. And this is not a new problem. So this country that we live in, the United States, is 244 years old. The first enslaved peoples from Africa arrived, as we understand it, in 1619. That's 401 years. So I'm going to make the argument that for at least 401 years, there have been people who have asked to be full participants in this system. And one of the earlier documented stories that we know about more broadly is that of Sojourner Truth, who gave the I Am a Woman speech in Massachusetts in the 1850s. We also know the name of Harriet Tubman. They often are referred to as suffragists for women's rights and for, the woman's right to vote. But when women can vote, that means, and especially if Black women can vote, that means everyone can vote, right? So I want to make sure we're clear on, they weren't just women. They weren't just women who were advocating for women's rights to vote. They were advocating for everyone's right to vote and be full and equal citizens. They did not see that in their lifetimes. Next, in the 1900s, we had Ida B. Wells, Juno Frankie Pierce, Mattie E. Coleman, Mary Church Terrell, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Septima Clark, Fannie Lou Hamer. Some of these names have become more prominent in recent years, and I've listened to some podcasts about these individual women and the work that they did in their lives. I need to learn more about them because some of them, from what I have read about, were very radical for their times. They'd be radical for now. And I think there's a lot that I can learn. And as I look to continue the legacy of fighting for voting rights in this country, but doing it through technology, I want to look to their example. I want to be led by their thinking. And I'm glad that we've taken a moment to honor and acknowledge the work that has come before. And I think, and my hope is that for the voter of the future, that they do the same and also continue the legacy.
Well, I thank you, because I didn't know any of those names either until you kind of brought them to my attention that says, hey, not only in what's happening with Georgia in 2020, but let's talk and look into the women in American history that have also, been fighting for this for centuries now, right? And the little progress that we are continually showing. We've taken plenty of steps back over that time, right? You think about what these women in the early 1900s were fighting for and where we are now. It shows how hard the work is and how long it is going to take. And so you talked a little bit, this wasn't necessarily on our agenda, but I know we talked about it, about the right for all people to vote. And you and I have had some discussions about the demographic turnouts and changes and everything. So I want to talk about that a little bit here. And we'll go into all of them because at least, and you and I kind of had a heated text discussion about this. And so I wanted to hear kind of.
I didn't feel like it was heated, though. I didn't feel like it was heated. It was certainly lively.
It was lively. It was lively. Look, like it was. I felt intense. I was like, oh man, at the time. But from a storytelling perspective and the narrative, I thought the election, the way it was unfolding, was so poetic. In this, it felt like a movie. So in June, George Floyd is murdered, and we go through. We've had months of protest and change, and lots of people who look like me doing deeper exploration about the history of racism, the things that they do every single day that have added to the inequality in the world. And then we get to this election, and not only we mentioned all these Black women who are making a huge difference to change the election, but as the votes are coming in, what we're seeing is Donald Trump is leading in most of these states, and then we see Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta all having ballots still coming in, right? Cities that are predominantly Black, right? historically suppressed, right? And those votes are the ones that are getting counted last and coming in and flipping the narrative and the direction of where the election was going to where we got to this point where all of a sudden it was like, oh, Joe Biden won Wisconsin, he won Minnesota, he won Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania. And I also want to give a shout out to Arizona because Arizona went blue a lot thanks to all of the votes by Native Americans and all those tribes that turned out. They deserve a huge shout out for what they did in Arizona as well. And these oppressed groups of people coming, and because their votes came in or were counted last, it just happened to be the narrative of like, look at these communities changing the election. That was just circumstance because of the way votes were counted specifically in those states. But you and I kind of went back and forth, and so what do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on that before we kind of keep going? And then I want to address the people who voted for Donald Trump as well.
The reason why we were going back and forth on that was because you were like, "Oh, this is great," and I was like, actually, I don't agree with the way the story is being told, because it sounds as if, the voters in these states were somehow doing something different than what all the other voters were doing. But it was what they should have said is that the process, we talked about this earlier, that the process prioritized other people's votes first. So the reason why so many Black voters were voting by mail was because of the pandemic. They were concerned about going and voting in person. And so in the places where it was an option for them, they took advantage of it. The Democratic Party really promoted that. So most of these voters voted blue. And so that's all there is to it. And for the election systems in those states, they prioritized the in-person vote that day first on election day, and then the mail-in ballot after. And so this was already predicted to happen. And Donald Trump himself actually said that this was his language strategy, right? So his language strategy before election day was, I will be shown to have been the winner on election day because all of the ballots that will be counted on election day will be for me because Republican voters traditionally vote in person on election day. That is exactly what happened. And he also said, any of these mail-in ballots are fraudulent, any of them. Any ballots that are counted after election day are fraudulent. So he was laying the groundwork for then what would become his legal argument. And while his legal argument may have fallen apart,
Uh-oh, we had a technical difficulty for all the listeners out there. The video people won't see this, but if you're listening to the podcast, all right, we're back.
All right. So, So what I was saying was that Donald Trump laid the rhetorical foundation to then be able to have the public relations angle that he could play, but then also allowed him to have this foundation for why he was going to put these lawsuits forward. So the strategy was very clear from the very beginning. And I think what's important about that is we should not, although the narrative makes us feel good, to be able to say, well, look at that. These Black voters, they showed up and then they just flipped this thing around. That's not what happened. They voted at the same time as everybody else. Yeah. And in fact, they probably voted before everyone else. Yeah. But their votes were not prioritized in the process. And that is the key. And this is why, for me, it's so important to understand the process, because at the same time that we have to understand the process, we also have to understand how the process will be used against people and challenged, because that's exactly what Republicans have been doing in Texas. It was the drive-through voting. In all of these other states where there were mail-in ballots, it was the mail-in ballot that they were challenging because they saw that as somehow an opportunity legally to be able to suppress votes, because they could say, well, the ballots were somehow cast illegally. And that has been, to this day, we continue to hear that. And I believe we're going to continue to hear that for the next 4 years, to cast doubt on the election system, but specifically where there are large populations of people of color, whether it's the Native American population in Arizona, or the Latino population in Nevada, or the African American population in Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Milwaukee. That's the other side of this, right? That's the other side that we might be thinking, hey, this is the great story that we want to tell ourselves that makes us feel good. The story that's being told on the other side is that these people are frauds. They're doing illegal things. They're trying to ruin democracy. Like, that's the story. And I think we need to be really clear about that and understand that we have some work to do to strengthen our system. It is not enough to say, great, these folks turned out. It is not enough to say that, yes, in this one election, in this one particular race, not in all of the races now, in this one particular race, these voters of color showed up and they overcame all of the barriers, the pandemic, the systemic tactical voter suppression. They overcame all of that, whether they had financial issues or issues of transportation or whatever, childcare issues. They overcame all of that to get their vote in.
Yes.
We shouldn't look at that as being, in my view, we shouldn't look at that as being the standard or to be great. We actually should work to make that better for people's lives. It should be easier to vote, and we shouldn't have to have these heroic stories of, look at this giant group of people from one population overcoming all of this to cast a ballot. This is your constitutional right. It should be just as easy for someone who looks like you as it is for someone who looks like me. And it should be just as easy for someone who is disabled as it is for someone who is able, just as easy for a woman as it is for a man. That's what I take away when I hear that story. I'm like, no. We're focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, and you really opened up my eyes to that, right? Because I was the one like cheering, like, oh, look at this narrative, like that's such a beautiful thing. And you really opened my eyes. It was like, yeah, but there's like all this tale, like, yeah, we're cheering this Disney fairy tale moment when it's like, it shouldn't have even had to be that way in the first place.
Right.
And I want to bring this up, and I think we're going to have a future episode about this because we've kind of initiated the conversation. Yes, it's great that we're all of these people of color showed up and they voted and they had their voice heard. But we can't discount the fact that 70 million white people showed up and voted against that, right? And voted against the safety of people who look like you, right? And supporting all the conspiracies and all the suppression and all of the terrible things, this not only historically, but in the last 4 years that we have seen the lies and the name calling and all of the non-presidential things, like, white people, what the hell? Like, it's embarrassing. It's really embarrassing. We have a history as white people in America of terrible, terrible, terrible decisions against our neighbors and our fellow citizens, also immigrants as well. And there's a reckoning that's going to need to come in order for us to actually have the America that we all have pie in the sky, that we think America could be, or what we want America to be, or what we think the Constitution is designing America to be. And white people think that exists, right? Because for most of white America, it does exist, right? And we don't think about the ways the systems are built that 100x, probably more, benefit us because of the way we look, pretty much exclusively because of the way we look. And this election, I hope, it was big on me, right? Because I was optimistic that we were going to have what everyone's saying, the repudiation of Donald Trump, and all these people were going to fire him. And I mean, it was 1% difference. Yes, it was 5. We're looking at 6 million votes, but 70 million people do not agree really with what we're saying at all right now. Right. And that is it's great. The people of color deserve all the applause and all of this credit. Yes. But as a culture of white people in a country that is at this point, majority still white, you and I both agree that eventually that's not going to be the case. And that will be a big difference. That's naturally going to happen. But we've got a lot of stuff to do. We got a lot of work to do within our own communities, right? I have family that I know support the Republican Party, and whether they voted for Trump or they didn't, I know people that voted for Trump. That's what it comes down to in my friend circle and in my family circle. And so it is our responsibility to continue to address and fight and advocate and stand up, right? Because it's not acceptable, and there's there should be more burden on people who look like me to be the change. We are if we're the ones that have the power, it's going to be up to us to change that dynamic. And white people as a whole, we've let you down, right? And we got to do better, and we can't give up, right? This is a very small battle that we won. Great to celebrate and cheer and dance in the street. Hopefully you're wearing a mask and you're practicing social distancing, because that was a little concerning too. But today, right? Things haven't changed systemically, right? Great. We got 2 people in the White House, but there is so much more work to do in our local communities, in our personal relationships, in our places of work, from top to bottom, that isn't ending today, and it's not over. And I want to put it out there. White people, we got to do better.
Thank you for saying that. I don't even want to say anything else beyond that, because that was so well articulated, and I'm very appreciative of you saying that, because there are a couple of things that triggered our discussion on this topic, offline, and it had a lot to do with some memes that I guess you call these memes. These days I don't know what's a meme and what's not, because some things are more informative, and then other things I'll just call it some educational content, but it was definitely an opinion piece. Because social media is where people get their news these days. And so, maybe you would have read something like this in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, 20, 30 years ago, and now you come across it on social media. I don't even know who the author of it was. I have no idea. But there were some things about what you just said that were, that resonated with me, that I saw within that. And I sent it to you, and I said, part of it is in the conversation, right, that we have. It's the black voters who voted for Trump, or the black voters who voted for Biden, or the Latino voters who voted for Trump versus voted for Biden. It's okay, but what about the white voters? White voters also are a group. And I think that is the challenge, right? That even within the media landscape, there is so much focus on the other that we are and we're distracted by that sometimes, when we really need to say, but what about the largest group and the standard that we are set, that is set, that creates the other, right? Yes. So that I think that's something I feel like now I want to, for us, as we have gotten to this point in our show, that I'm okay, we can start to talk a little bit more about race. We can start to talk a little bit more about whiteness specifically, right? Because ultimately, I agree with you 100% that there needs to be some focus and conversation around what does all of this mean when we talk about the future? What does this mean to white people? How does that look different versus how it looks to non-white people. I mean, I think, one of the things that I mentioned to you was that, as a non-white person, for the most part, what whiteness is and how it exists in the world, because your entire lived experience is defined by otherness, by being non-white. So everything around you is framed that way. But one of the things that is very different when everything around you is the standard, is that it becomes very easy to opt out of the conversation about, is this the right standard? And so that has always been, for me, a giant barrier to progress. And I believe we need to have a reckoning, not on race, but on whiteness. And what does that mean? How does it manifest itself in this entire socioeconomic system? I should say global socioeconomic system, not just this country. This is a global issue. So to me, I think it is important. And I know that it's something that, as we've talked about it, and as I've heard other people have the conversation, there is a level of discomfort that many people who identify as white feel when having this conversation. And while there are people who are very comfortable, acknowledging privilege and acknowledging history, there are many people who are not, because also wrapped up in this is wealth. Also wrapped up in this is power. Also wrapped up in this is ownership, right? And that is hard to talk about. That is hard to dismantle. And no one wants to be called a racist. No one wants to feel as if someone is pointing a finger at them. And I can see how it will be very difficult to have these conversations. But something you told me was that I thought about a lot, and I agree with, is that it actually is going to start with having one-on-one conversations that we will not be able to get to a national and international conversation without saying that as we go forward from here, right? When we talk about doing the work, when we talk about action, this is it. So yeah, Biden and Harris, they're in office. That's great. We also have, elected officials at the state level, the county level, city level. That's great. But we as individuals, we also have work to do, because we are the voters. This is our country. This is our planet. So we have to have a conversation. And the way that we do that, the way that we start that, is just like what we're doing right now. You and I are having conversations saying, listen, this is my perspective. This is your perspective. Here, let's inform our perspectives. Let's talk about it. Because your question that you posed back to me is, okay, well, what does action look like then? And I'm thinking, I don't know. This is a big issue. But then when we talk about the conversation, well, that's not that big, because that's two people. You're someone I know, right? You know other people, so you can have conversations with them. I can have conversations with other people in my life. And I think that's how we start, because we have many more elections to come. And we need voters to start to shift their perspective about what matters. We cannot solve problems if we continue to be individualistic, if we continue to be selfish in our thinking. Well, it's just about the economy. I only care about the taxes and my paycheck. We are all in this thing together, whether it's the socioeconomic system or the issues of the planet. We all are in it together. We cannot separate ourselves from that, no matter how comfortable it makes us. So for me, I do see, having conversations and being very specific about what we're talking about, not just to say, well, we're going to talk about race. No, we're going to talk about whiteness. That's the reality. Like that, I think we have to do that. And I think once enough of us are having those conversations and thinking about these issues, we can bring more people into the conversation. And as we're bringing people into the conversation, we can start talking about, how are we going to make this world better? We will not solve the issue of race in our lifetimes, right? But we have to be thinking further along, that there will be generations after us, and we want them to live in a world that it doesn't look like this. We shouldn't have to have conversations about voter suppression that go all the way back to the 1800s. Let's try not to make that the legacy that we leave. Let's try not to make that what is their inheritance culturally, right?
A point I want to talk about quickly was the small conversations are social action, right? It was like, all right, what do we do? And those small conversations can have as much of a big impact as a lot of these big other things. Like you and I had this text conversation yesterday morning, and then I was on a Zoom last night with my friends. There were 6 of us. There was 4 white people, including myself, my wife who's Asian, and another guy who is Native American, right? And we had this conversation about whiteness. And it was like a continuation, right? And it was good, right? Because when I have a conversation with you about whiteness, it's very different than when I go talk with white people and we actually address like white identity, which is a conversation not in this explicit way that we had actually had before. And these are pretty much the most trusted friends in my life, so that's a good place to start. But it's great to like build that conversation and start having that and talking about identity and the things that we can do to change that narrative. And then the one other thing that I want to give a tip on, I want to applaud you on how you brought this up, right? And it was through text message, and right away I was like, this is not a great way through text message, but you and I commute a lot through text before we had this show. And you put it out in a very powerful way that I went through a whole roller coaster of emotions from like anxiety, fear, curiosity, joy. Like I kind of went through all of it as I was like processing what you said to me, but you just very kindly put it out there, like saying, I want to make sure, Conner, that you're comfortable. And I haven't talked about whiteness specifically because I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. Right. But we're at this point in the conversation that, you know, how do you feel about that? And you even gave me the option to opt out. Right. And I think that is a really good learning lesson about if you want to have this conversation and you look more like Mr. Well-Traveled and you want to have the conversation with someone who looks more like me, unfortunately, it sucks that we have to ask that. But having that empathetic approach was so beneficial for starting that conversation. And that is a great tip. Like if you want to be proactive about that, like you have to approach this conversation with empathy because it's intense, it's emotional. Everyone has very different experiences with this, no matter who you are, what you look like. And I just appreciate that you put that out there, that you just showed this care for me and my feelings that I really admire that you did that. It was very thoughtful and very kind. And it led to kind of this conversation and me thinking about it the last 24 hours. And kind of that rant that I had about it was all stemmed from the way that you approached me about it. So thank you.
Wow. I'm like, you've rendered me speechless, which is not that doesn't happen often. So I'm just, I'm very glad to hear that, and I'm glad that you feel that way and that you've been open, you know, and I appreciate you being open to the conversation. And yeah, I mean, as friends, one could say that, sure, we can just talk about anything, but I also recognize that it is not easy to have conversations, particularly around whiteness. And so one thing that I don't want is that just because that's a topic that I want to bring up to make you in any way feel like that's something that we have to discuss, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't have to discuss that. There are plenty of people I could have that conversation with. And I think the other thing for me was I've seen a lot of things over the last like for years. People getting very aggressive and people just being like in your face, like, I don't care about how you feel. And I get that too.
Yeah,
I do. But I also don't feel like that is the approach that I want to take, or that will lead to us being able to have a very productive conversation.
yeah.
And I think what I was really worried about was that, like, if we go down a path that we can't come back from, then I also lose a friend. And I really value you as a friend. And I value anyone that I consider to be a friend. And there are many people that I'm friends with that I don't always see eye to eye with on whatever issue we are talking about. So this is not one in which I feel like I want to make I want to plant my flag in this and say, you're going to talk to me about this and you're going to agree with me, or we can't even be friends anymore. Like, that's just not going to happen. So, and so I thought, what is the best way for me to approach this? I feel a particular way about this topic, and I want to have this conversation, but I also want to do it in a way that makes you feel like you can come to the table with me, right? And be there with me in the conversation. And so I have been thinking a lot about this, because even in my work now, I'll be next week or this week coming up, giving a presentation about the Next Step app to my team. And my team is my team at work, the people I work with, are all white. So I'm the only African-American on the team. So I was thinking, like, how do I bring them into this discussion that's very much about being a marginalized person and helping them to be able to fully participate, right? I recognize many people run from conversations like that. And so I have to learn how to do that. That's part of what I have to do, because what's important to me is that we make progress. What's important to me is that we use our platforms, whether it's in our jobs or whether it's our own podcasts or whether it's blogs or wherever we can, to continue to push for progress. And as a form of action, these small conversations matter, but also our approach to the small conversations really matter too.
Certainly. And beyond just race, right? So many other things with family, with the gender discrimination issues, with economic issues. There are so many learning lessons that you can apply to a lot of conversations with how to approach people. And yeah, that's a tough situation for you to be thrust in to say, let's talk about this and address all these white people and discuss the topic of whiteness is because white people are scared of that conversation, right? I think we've made improvements this year because of the George Floyd protests, and a lot more people have opened their minds and done more self-reflection. And that's, it's a good start, but it's going to have to continue to go, because it was very clear, we learned in this election, that those conversations didn't go very deep across the country, right? Like, it hit a lot of the major spots where there were big protests, right? I think that there was a decent impact here in Seattle, but when you look at the votes, we still had, 1.5 million people vote for Donald Trump here in Washington alone. So there's a long way to go to having these conversations. And just because you're in a blue state doesn't mean that your job's over or that you've done anything really worth much that has changed. There's still a long way to go and a lot of conversations to have. And this is a small start, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And I just really appreciate that you brought it up in the way that you did. So we've been going for a long time here. And I think we should do an episode about identity, and we can really focus on whiteness, because I've been thinking about that a lot more. It's very interesting. I'll be way more conscious of it now moving forward. Because as a white person, I don't really think about being white as part of my identity, where being black is for you, right? For my wife, Amanda, she's a first generation American. She's a woman. She's Asian. Like, those are cornerstones of her foundation. And so just like evaluating myself, like, I've never really what I look like in those terms haven't applied to me, but I think we need to have those conversations more. And so I think we should. All right. Conclusion time. You got any final thoughts or things that we missed or things that you want to say to start wrapping this up?
Yeah, so if you're a voter in the future and you're listening to this, I hope you have enjoyed our perspectives today. I hope that in the time that you're in, whether it's, a few months from now, or if it's, say, a few years from now, or even, decades from now, I hope that you keep your head up, stay encouraged. I'm hoping that you're listening to this because you need some inspiration, you need some foundational knowledge. I'm hoping that things are not so challenging for you as they have been for us. But I imagine that it is possible that you're listening to this because there is something happening in your time that threatens your life and your future. And maybe you're looking for some tools and tactics. So I want you to really think about our words today and know that we are optimistic in this moment for the future, and I hope that you will be as well. We are also committing at this moment to continuing to do the work that is the self-education work. So that is listening to podcasts. Maybe, I don't know if there will be podcasts in the future, but there'll be something to listen to. So we're going to continue to read books and articles and have the conversations. We're going to support organizations that are organizing on behalf of all voters. So I encourage you to do that in your time, whatever that looks like in your time, whatever the tools that you have are in your time. And remember in your time that just like our time and in previous times, that we are the ones who do have the power. We don't have to allow our systems to just be what they are. The status quo does not have to continue. It is up to us to be able to fight for that. And it may not happen immediately. Generally, that's not how things work. But us understanding that and working together and continuing to push forward, that will make life better in the short term and the long term. So please, whatever you're doing as you're listening to this, please continue that.
Very well said. Very well said. Well, that concludes episode 6 of Community is a Verb. I want to say thank you to my wonderful co-host, Mr. Well-Traveled. I am Conner Cayson. You can find us anywhere online. He is at Mr. Well-Traveled. I'm at Find Me in Seattle. Please reach out if you're listening to this. We'd also love to ask you to, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. We've got lots of videos coming out. We chop these up and have nice little segments. And if you're listening to the podcast, please just scroll down, give us those 5 stars, write a review if you're so inclined, that those reviews do a lot for us. And we'd love to continue this conversation with you. So please reach out somewhere on the internet and say hi. We'd love to hear from you. Mr. Well-Traveled, I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you.